The sky over Lochdabuff was a piercing, cloudless blue, bringing with it the kind of bone-chilling winter frost that made the heather crunch like broken glass underfoot. It was a beautiful, clear morning, and PC Hamish Macbeth deeply resented it. Clear weather meant the villagers were out and about, and villagers out and about meant complaints about wandering sheep, boundary disputes, and parking infractions. Hamish, a tall, gangling Highlander with fiery red hair and hazel eyes that missed absolutely nothing, was currently doing his utmost to avoid the responsibilities of his uniform. He was hunkered down in a thick, slightly shabby police greatcoat by the frozen edge of the loch, a fishing rod resting lazily in his gloved hands. He was entirely content to let the phone in his police station ring itself into a melted lump of plastic. If it was headquarters in Strathbane, they would only want him to do actual police work, which carried the terrifying risk of drawing attention to himself. The last thing Hamish wanted was a promotion that would drag him away from his comfortable, slow-paced life and deposit him in some dreary city filled with crime and competent officers. Beside him sat Lugs, a dog of indeterminate breed and fierce, often misplaced loyalty. Lugs was currently staring with great intensity at a patch of frost, occasionally offering a low growl just to let the ice know who was boss. I know, Hamish murmured, his breath pluming in the freezing air. If it's Blair on the phone, tell him I've been tracking a very dangerous badger up Ben. A slow, invisible badger. The crisp silence of the Highland morning was suddenly shattered. It wasn't the smooth, purring arrival of a luxury vehicle, which would have at least had the decency to glide quietly through the village, but the rattling, coughing, metallic death rattle of the regional mail bus. It screeched to a halt near the waterfront, disgorging a thick cloud of black diesel fumes and a man who looked entirely too loud for the Scottish Highlands in January. His name, as the village grapevine would establish within the hour, was Bartholomew Crane. He was a Londoner, clad in a neon, orange puffer jacket that physically assaulted the eyes, and he carried a clipboard as though it were a shield against the local peasantry. Crane was a self-proclaimed lifestyle guru and property developer who had recently purchased a dilapidated crofter's cottage at the edge of the village, loudly announcing his plans to transform it into an eco-minimalist mindfulness retreat. Hamish watched from his concealed spot in the reeds as Crane immediately began berating the bus driver. Poor old Mrs. Wellington. It is absolutely barbaric. Crane's reedy, impatient voice drifted over the frosty water. The suspension on this relic has entirely realigned my spine. And I've already checked your little shop. Not a single carton of unsweetened oat milk to be found. How do you people survive in this cultural vacuum? Mrs. Wellington, who had survived 2 harsh winters entirely on shortbread and spite, simply glared at him, dumped his excessively large, brightly colored rucksack onto the frozen mud, and drove off in a cloud of exhaust. Hamish shrank a little lower in his coat. He had no desire to face Assassinach today. Such people always brought trouble. They demanded high-speed internet where there was barely a phone signal, complained endlessly about the smell of the sheep, and generated an agonizing stream of paperwork that threatened Hamish's meticulously crafted facade of total incompetence. Crane dusted off his rucksack with a look of profound disgust, his expensive hiking boots squeaking loudly on the frost as he marched toward the Lochdabuff Hotel, radiating an arrogance that instantly rubbed the entire village the wrong way. Hamish slowly reeled in his line, catching nothing but a stray piece of frozen kelp. He sighed, feeling a familiar, heavy dread settling in his stomach. He decided it was time to retreat to the warmth of his station, fire up the stove, and brew a very strong black coffee. The peaceful village of Lochdabuff was about to get very noisy, and Hamish Macbeth intended to ignore it for as long as humanly possible. The following morning, a thick, freezing fog had rolled off the sea loch, turning Lochdabuff into a village of grey ghosts. Inside the police station, however, PC Hamish Macbeth had achieved a state of profound comfort. He was slumped in the battered armchair next to a roaring stove, nursing a dangerously thick mug of black coffee. On the rug beside him, Lugs was snoring rhythmically, twitching as he dreamed of chasing rabbits he would never actually catch. It was a Tuesday, a day Hamish firmly believed should be exempt from any form of strenuous activity. He had a massive pot of stew simmering slowly on the back burner, filling the small station with the rich, savory scent of beef and carrots. His grand plan for the afternoon consisted entirely of eating that stew and perhaps reading an old newspaper. Naturally, the universe could not let him be happy. The shrill, demanding ring of the telephone shattered the warm silence. Hamish squeezed his eyes shut, hoping that if he ignored it long enough, the caller would simply give up and bother someone else. But the ringing persisted, angry and unrelenting. With a heavy sigh conveying the burden of his existence, Hamish hauled himself up and picked up the receiver. "Macbeth," he answered, his voice thick with cultivated lethargy. "Hamish, it's Angus over at the old McNaircroft," came the frantic voice of Angus MacDonald, the local builder whom Bartholomew Crane had foolishly hired to renovate his ruin. "You'd better get up here, lad. It's that English fellow, the loud one. Has he lost his oat milk, Angus?" Hamish asked, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "He's dead, Hamish, hanging like a cured ham in the barn." Hamish closed his eyes and mourned his ruined Tuesday. A murder meant headquarters. Headquarters meant DCI Blair. DCI Blair meant shouting paperwork and an agonizing disruption of Hamish's carefully managed incompetence. "Don't touch anything, Angus," Hamish muttered. "I'll be there when I've found my boots." He didn't rush. Rushing was for city police and anxious terriers. He finished his coffee to the very last bitter drop, pulled on his heavy, slightly moth-eaten police greatcoat, and fastened the brass buttons crookedly. He ran a hand through his flaming red hair, ensuring it stood up in a suitably unkempt, foolish-looking thatch. "Come on, lugs," he called. "We have a Sassenach to inspect." The walk to the edge of the village was a miserable trudge through the freezing fog. The damp air made lugs sneeze. When they arrived at the crumbling stone walls of the McNaircroft, Angus was standing outside, shivering and looking distinctly green. "In the old barn," Angus pointed a trembling finger. Hamish ducked under the rotting jumper, entering the gloom of the barn. The air inside was freezing, smelling of ancient hay and damp earth. And there, suspended from a sturdy, exposed roof beam, was Bartholomew Crane. It was, no doubt, a bizarre and humiliating way to die. Crane was hanging upside down, secured by a complex, bright purple fabric contraption that looked like a hammock crossed with a medieval torture device. The neon orange puffer jacket was zipped up to his chin, but gravity had pulled it awkwardly around his ears. His face, visible in the pale light filtering through the broken roof, was a terrifying shade of mottled purple, his eyes bulging behind designer spectacles that had miraculously stayed on his nose. "He called it an inversion therapy swing," Angus whispered from the doorway, unwilling to step closer. "Said hanging upside down aligned his chakras and improved his cosmic flow. It seems to have stopped his flow entirely," Hamish observed mildly. To the casual observer, it might have looked like a tragic, idiotic accident, a wellness routine gone terribly wrong in a freezing Scottish barn. But Hamish Macbeth was no casual observer. While looking entirely half asleep, his sharp hazel eyes scanned the scene, cataloguing details with the precision of a computer. He noted that Crane's expensive, squeaky hiking boots were missing. He was wearing only thick, brightly striped woolen socks. More interestingly, the frost on the dirt floor beneath the swinging body had been scuffed and trampled by heavy boots much larger than Crane's stockinged feet. Hamish crouched down, his knees popping loudly in the quiet barn. Lugs sniffed at a patch of dirt and sneezed again. Beside the scuffed earth lay Crane's clipboard, the one he had wielded like a weapon yesterday. Hamish pulled a perfectly clean, folded handkerchief from his pocket, the only tidy thing about him, and gently nudged the clipboard open. The top page, which had contained his grand, arrogant plans for the eco-retreat, was torn in half. Someone had been here. Someone had watched the irritating lifestyle guru hang upside down, or perhaps forced him into the contraption, and then left him to freeze and suffocate in the Highland fog. Hamish stood up slowly, brushing dirt from his trousers. He felt a cold knot of certainty in his chest that had nothing to do with the weather. This wasn't an accident. It was murder. And worse, it was a murder that was going to completely ruin his week. The tranquility of the crime scene was shattered precisely 40 minutes later. The disruption began not with a respectful approach, but with the frantic, siren-wailing arrival of 3 black police vehicles that tore up the narrow, rutted track, spraying mud and gravel over the stone walls of the croft. Hamish Macbeth was standing by the barn entrance, attempting to look as though he were contemplating the beauty of the mist when the lead car skidded to a halt. The door flew open, and out stepped Detective Chief Inspector Blair, a man whose face seemed permanently set to a shade of apoplectic puce. Blair was followed by a retinue of junior officers who looked far too polished for the damp, unforgiving reality of a Highland winter. "Macbeth," Blair roared, his voice echoing off the nearby mountainside. He stomped over, his expensive, city-polished shoes instantly ruined by the freezing muck. "What in the hell have you done now? Why am I being dragged away from a perfectly good committee meeting in Strathbane for a bloody corpse in a barn?" Hamish leaned against the rough stone wall, his thumbs tucked into his belt. He gave Blair a look of practiced, wide-eyed bewilderment. "It's a bit of a pickle, sir," he drawled, his voice slow and soft. "The poor man seems to have turned himself inside out, as it were." Blair shoved past him, nearly knocking Lugs aside. The dog offered a low, unimpressed huff and trotted off to sniff a nearby bush. Blair ducked into the barn, his subordinates scurrying after him, like eager ducklings. A moment later, the inspector's shrill, high-pitched yelp of shock reverberated through the rafters. "Good God, man, look at him!" Blair emerged, his face now a shade of purple that bordered on the medical. He jabbed a trembling, ink-stained finger at Hamish's chest. "It's a suicide, you absolute simpleton." The man was a lunatic, dangling himself from the ceiling like a festive decoration. "This is not a crime. It is an inconvenience." "Might be," Hamish said, looking at the distant hills. "Though it is a bit strange, sir, how he managed to lock the barn door from the outside." Blair's jaw went slack. He blinked, his eyes darting toward the heavy iron-latched door that Hamish had indeed found secured when he arrived with Angus. The inspector quickly recovered his composure, his sneer returning with a vengeance. "Do not try to play detective with me, Macbeth. I know your type. You're just trying to make a mountain out of a molehill so you can look busy and avoid your actual paperwork. This is clearly a case of a deranged outsider getting tangled in his own absurdity." He turned to his lead sergeant, a young man who looked like he had never spent a day in the field without a GPS device. "Sergeant, wrap it up. Log it as an accidental death due to misadventure. I want this eyesore cleared out and the report on my desk by tonight so I can get back to civilization." Hamish watched the scene with a sinking heart. It was exactly as he had expected. Blair didn't want the truth. He wanted a quick, clean resolution that allowed him to retreat to his warm office and collect his commendations. Blair looked at the villagers, who had begun to gather at the edge of the property, with open disdain. "I've got a lead, sir," Hamish interjected, his voice still deceptively flat. "Angus here mentioned that Crane had a falling out with the local estate agent just yesterday. Seems there was a dispute over the property boundaries. A bit heated, by all accounts." Blair spun around, his eyes narrowed into slits of pure malice. "The estate agent? You mean Mrs. Campbell, the respectable woman who bakes scones for the police station?" He laughed. A harsh bark-like sound that made the birds in the nearby trees take flight. "You see, this is why you are still a village constable. Macbeth, you see a mystery under every rock, because you haven't the brain cells to comprehend a simple accident. You are a useless peasant, and if you dare suggest another absurdity, I will have your badge before the sun sets." He moved closer, his breath smelling of stale coffee and cigarettes. "Stay out of this. Hamish, you are officially off the case. My men will handle the investigation, which, for the record, consists of verifying that the man is indeed dead and that gravity is still working. If I catch you so much as looking at a witness, I will personally see to it that you are transferred to the traffic unit in the most congested corner of Glasgow. Do you understand?" Hamish looked at his feet, projecting the image of a defeated dim-witted man being scolded by a superior. "Yes, sir. Sorry, sir." "Get out of my sight," Blair snarled. "Go back to your little station and play with your dog. Leave the real work to the professionals." As Blair began barking orders to his team, strutting around the crime scene like a rooster in a henhouse, Hamish slowly turned and began the long walk back to his station. He wasn't insulted. He was pleased. The more Blair underestimated him, the more invisible he became. Blair had ignored the missing boots, the torn clipboard, and the locked door, all because he was too busy being loud and important. Hamish whistled softly to Lugs. They were off the case, officially, which meant, in the way things usually worked in Lockdobuff, they were now the only ones actually on it. He reached into his pocket and fingered a small, crumpled receipt he had swiped from the barn floor before Blair arrived. A receipt for a heavy-duty, industrial-grade rope, dated the day before. It was tucked into a pocket in the lining of his coat, a secret held tight against the cold, quiet wind of the Highlands. The village of Lockdove was a small place, and in a small place, nothing remained a secret for long, even when the police, or at least the official, loudmouth variety, did their best to bury it. DCI Blair's team had cordoned off the McNair Croft, but they couldn't cordon off the village's collective curiosity. As Hamish wandered through the narrow, winding streets toward the local shop, he found the atmosphere thick with hushed whispers and nervous glances. Hamish knew that to solve a puzzle in Lockdobuff, one did not look for fingerprints or analyze tire tracks. One sought the cracks in the social fabric. He pulled his hat low against the biting wind and ducked into the warm, cluttered sanctuary of the post office and shop. Run by Mrs. Guthrie, the shop smelled wonderfully of paraffin, damp wool, and sweet biscuits. "Morning, Mrs. Guthrie," Hamish said, leaning against the counter with an air of practiced aimlessness. "A bit of a chill in the air, wouldn't you say, Mrs. Guthrie?" A woman who knew the sins of every soul from here to the coast peered at him over her spectacles. "Don't you be starting with the weather, Hamish Macbeth. You're here about that poor man in the barn, or should I say, that dead man?" "Oh, just picking up some tea," Hamish replied, his voice soft and slow. "Terrible business, that. The police. They've got it all sorted out, of course. Accidental hanging. Shame, really." Mrs. Guthrie let out a sharp, scoffing laugh that sounded like a dry branch snapping. "Accident? That man couldn't tie his own shoelaces without a seminar on cognitive grounding. Never mind construct a complex rigging system for a death trap. He was terrified of germs. Hamish. He wouldn't have touched that dusty old barn with a 10-foot pole, unless someone had been prodding him." Hamish carefully examined a tin of biscuits, as if he were trying to memorize its history. "Is that so now? That is curious. Did he have enemies? Aside from the general public, of course." "He had enemies everywhere," she said, leaning in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "He was constantly arguing with the local carpenter, Angus, over the quality of the timber, and he was positively venomous toward the minister's wife, claiming her charity drive was socially performative. But the one who really had it in for him was that new assistant of his, a quiet lad named Callum. Crane treated him like a piece of furniture, snapping his fingers and demanding espressos at all hours. I saw them arguing by the lock 2 days ago. Crane looked like he was ready to strike the boy. Hamish nodded, thanking her with a vague, pleasant smile. He left the shop with a box of biscuits and a heavy sense of purpose. He didn't head back to the crime scene. He headed toward the small, wind-whipped cafe where Callum, the assistant, spent his afternoons shivering over a lukewarm latte. He found the lad sitting in the corner, staring morosely at his phone. Hamish pulled up a chair without asking and sat down, letting out a long, weary sigh. "Terrible business about Mr. Crane," Hamish said, opening his box of biscuits and offering one to the boy. Callum jumped, almost tipping his cup. He looked pale and frayed, his eyes bloodshot. "I didn't do it, if that's what you're thinking. I was at the inn all evening." "I never said you did," Hamish replied, munching on a biscuit with slow, deliberate enjoyment. "It's just that the police are so eager to blame the victim for his own demise. It's hard, isn't it? Working for a man who doesn't see you as a person." The boy's face crumpled. "The dam broke?" and the words came pouring out, a torrent of frustration, humiliation, and deep-seated rage. He told Hamish about the stolen ideas, the public belittling, and the way Crane had threatened to ruin his reputation if he ever tried to quit. It was a classic tale of a power imbalance, fueled by the arrogance of an outsider who thought he owned the world. He told me that if I didn't help him set up that inversion rig, he'd fire me and see to it I never worked in the village again. Callum confessed, his voice trembling. I helped him rig it, but I left before he even got in. He was fine when I left. He was alive. I swear. Hamish watched him, his gaze kind and unthreatening. I believe you, lad. He left the cafe, his mind whirring. Callum had the motive, and he had the opportunity. But he didn't have the cold, calculated heart of a killer. There was something else at play here. Something more personal, more tied to the history of the land itself. He walked down toward the curry shop, hoping to find the proprietor, a man who possessed an uncanny ability to hear the echoes of village gossip from miles away. As he walked, the wind gusted, smelling of snow and secrets. Blair was still at the croft, shouting at trees and intimidating the local sheep, entirely oblivious to the fact that the real motive for the murder wasn't in the barn. It was buried deep in the village's past, and someone was willing to kill to keep it there. Hamish stopped by the water, looking out at the grey, churning loch. He thought about the missing boots. Crane hadn't just been killed. He had been stripped of his identity. He had been made to look foolish in death, just as he had made others feel small in life. This wasn't just murder. It was an eviction, and Hamish knew exactly who held the keys to the property and the grudge. He just needed the final, quiet piece of the puzzle. The evening mist had turned into a steady, freezing drizzle that coated the village streets in a slick, dark sheen. Hamish Macbeth, having successfully avoided DCI Blair's latest perimeter sweep by hiding behind a stack of hay bales for a solid hour, was now making his way toward the grand, stone-hewn residence of the local gentry. He needed a sounding board, and there was only one person in Lockduff whose intellect was as sharp as her tongue and who occasionally tolerated his company despite his infuriating lack of ambition. He arrived at the mansion, and after a moment's hesitation, knocked on the heavy oak door. Priscilla Halberton Smythe opened it. She looked as poised and polished as a marble statue, dressed in a thick wool sweater that probably cost more than Hamish's entire annual uniform budget. Hamish, she said, her eyebrows arching slightly, you look like a drowned rat, and you smell faintly of wet dog and cold stew. Do come in, before the neighbours think I've taken to charity work for the local vagrants. Hamish offered a lopsided, endearing grin and stepped into the warmth of the hallway. Good to see you too, Priscilla. I'm afraid the investigation has left me a bit worse for wear. Investigation? You mean the disaster at the McNair Croft? She led him into the library, where a fire was crackling in the hearth. I heard Blair is tearing the village apart. He's already accused the postman of some elaborate conspiracy involving the ropes. It's absolutely pathetic. Hamish settled into a leather armchair, shivering slightly as his damp clothes began to steam in the heat. Blair is a fool, but he's dangerous. He's going to pin this on the lad, Callum. The boy had a motive, and Blair doesn't have the patience to seek the truth. Priscilla poured a glass of single malt whiskey and handed it to him, her gaze appraising. And what does the village constable think when he isn't busy avoiding work? I think someone wanted Crane gone, but not just because they hated him, Hamish said, taking a sip of the golden liquid. Crane was looking to transform the croft into an eco-retreat. He was obsessed with the history of the land, going through the archives at the records office. He told me he'd found something, a title dispute, that could invalidate the ownership of half the cottages on the northern ridge. Priscilla froze, her hand halfway to her own glass. A title dispute? That's ancient history. Those deeds were settled decades ago. Not according to Crane, Hamish continued, his voice dropping to that soft rhythmic cadence that usually hid his brilliance. He was convinced that the original land grants were flawed. If he went public, he wouldn't just be an annoying neighbour, he'd be a threat to the livelihoods of some of the oldest families in Lockduff, including, perhaps, your own extended kin. Priscilla looked away, her eyes fixed on the dancing flames. My family's land is secure, Hamish. But I suppose there are others who wouldn't want those old papers seeing the light of day. But why the theatrics? Why the upside-down hanging? The bizarre ritual of it? To make it look like a tragic, ridiculous accident, Hamish replied. Some I know wanted to ensure that the police would dismiss it as the folly of an eccentric outsider. If it looked like a crime, people would start asking questions about motives. If it looked like a comedy of errors, the police would just sigh and move on. You're suggesting a calculated, cold-blooded murder, Priscilla said. Turning back to him, her expression was unreadable. But there was a flicker of genuine concern in her eyes. Hamish, if you start digging into the village's land history, you're going to be stepping on a lot of toes. Powerful toes. Blair will love it if you make a mistake. He's waiting for you to trip up. I know, Hamish sighed, leaning back and closing his eyes. But I can't let them pin it on the boy. Callum is soft-hearted and foolish, but he isn't a killer. Priscilla studied him for a long moment. The silence between them filled only by the crackling fire. You are a stubborn man, Hamish Macbeth. You claim you want a quiet life, yet you spend all your time inserting yourself into the most chaotic events in the Highlands. I just want to be left alone, Hamish mumbled. But peace in Lockduff is fragile. When someone starts breaking the rules, it disrupts the whole rhythm of the village. It's like a sour note in a song, or a crack in a foundation, Priscilla corrected. She walked to her desk and pulled out a leather-bound folder. If you're going to be an idiot, you might as well be an informed one. These are the historical land records for the Northern Ridge. I was doing some research for the Historical Society last month. There's a section in there, a footnote, that Crane might have been interested in. Hamish opened the folder, his eyes tracing the faded ink of the old documents. His heart skipped a beat as he saw a name, one that had been absent from the current village register but was prominent in the old deeds. He looked up at Priscilla, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. Thank you, Priscilla. Don't thank me, she said, returning to the fire. Just don't get yourself killed. I'd hate to have to find a new person to argue with over tea. Hamish left the manor feeling a strange, heavy clarity. He had the motive, and he had the potential suspect. The pieces were beginning to align. And for once, he wasn't just observing the village's secrets. He was part of the machinery of truth. He merely hoped that when the time came, he could solve the mystery without bringing the wrath of the entire Highlands down upon his head. He whistled for lugs, and together they vanished into the cold, swirling fog of the night, headed toward the final confrontation he knew was coming. By the following morning, the atmosphere in Lockduff had soured into a palpable, biting tension. The rumour mill, fueled by the arrival of DCI Blair's press team, had churned out a dozen different versions of Bartholomew Crane's demise. The most popular theory, heavily promoted by Blair during a staged press conference in the village square, was that the arrogant Londoner had attempted a dangerous, unregulated fitness routine, lost his footing, and met a self-inflicted end. Hamish Macbeth watched from the doorway of the post office as Blair, looking triumphant and smelling of expensive aftershave, shook hands with the local mayor. A tragic accident, Blair boomed, his voice carrying clearly in the crisp, cold air. Case closed. The investigation is officially terminated. Hamish didn't join the applause. Instead, he slipped away, his mind ticking over the details he had gathered. He had spent the previous night hunched over the documents Priscilla had given him, specifically the footnote regarding the original, disputed land deeds of the Northern Ridge. The records were dense, written in the cramped, archaic hand of an 18th-century lawyer, but they revealed a glaring discrepancy. The McNair Croft, which Crane had been so excited to renovate, wasn't just a piece of property. It was the linchpin for a dormant water rights claim that would, if legally validated, effectively bankrupt the wealthiest estate in the valley. Hamish knew Blair was about to close the file on a suicide, effectively burying the truth along with Crane. He needed to act, but he had to do it with the subtle precision of a shadow. He slipped through the back lanes of the village, avoiding the main thoroughfares where Blair's officers were still patrolling. He needed to catch the one person who had been acting increasingly erratic since the body was found. He found Angus, the local builder, working on a fence line at the edge of the woods. The man was jumpy, his hands shaking as he hammered a post into the hard, frozen earth. He didn't see Hamish approaching until the constable was standing right behind him. "It's a cold morning for hard labor, Angus," Hamish remarked, his voice soft and non-threatening. Angus spun around, his face white. "Hamish, you startled me. I was just looking at those boots of yours, Angus," Hamish said, gesturing to the heavy mud-caked footwear on the man's feet. "Size 12, heavy tread, very distinctive." Angus took a step back, his eyes darting toward the tree line. "What are you talking about?" "I found scuff marks in the barn, Angus. Large ones. The kind that doesn't match a city boy's dainty hiking boots." Hamish stepped closer, his posture relaxed, his eyes locked onto the builders. "And I found a receipt tucked away in the shadows of that old loft. A receipt for heavy-duty rope, bought just 2 days ago. Signed by someone who knows exactly how to build a rigging system that won't give way." "That doesn't mean anything," Angus shouted, his voice cracking. "I bought the rope for the renovation. I was fixing the barn roof. It was a very specific type of rope." "Angus, the kind used in climbing, not in carpentry," Hamish said, his tone still maddeningly calm. "But that's not what I'm curious about. I'm curious about why you were the one who found the body. Why were you so eager to point the finger at the lad, Callum? You knew the boy had a grudge against Crane, and you thought that made him the perfect scapegoat." Angus began to pace, his breathing ragged. "He was going to ruin us, Hamish. Crane. He wasn't just some tourist. He was an agent for a developer who wanted to buy up the whole northern ridge. He found those records, and he was going to turn this place into a high-end resort. He would have pushed us all. Our families, our homes, all gone. So you killed him," Hamish said, stating the fact, rather than asking a question. "I didn't kill him," Angus roared, slamming his hammer into the mud. I taught him a lesson. I forced him into that swing. Sure, I wanted to scare him, make him look like the fool he was. Maybe get him to leave the village in shame. I left him there, suspended. He was alive when I left that barn. I swear." Hamish felt a surge of cold reality. "You left him hanging, Angus, in this temperature. You didn't kill him directly, but you sentenced him to a slow, freezing death. That's still murder in the eyes of the law." Angus collapsed onto a stack of wood, his head in his hands, weeping openly. I didn't want him to die. I just wanted him gone." Hamish looked at him, feeling a strange mix of pity and grim resolve. He knew Angus was telling the truth about his intent, but he also knew that the builder was a man who had let his fear and hatred drive him to a point of no return. But as Hamish watched him, he realized something else, something that didn't fit. Angus was too simple, too direct. If he had meant for Crane to die, he wouldn't have been so obvious with the evidence. He had been manipulated. "Who told you about the water rights, Angus?" Hamish asked suddenly. "Who told you that Crane was planning to buy up the ridge?" Angus looked up, his eyes bleary. "The woman at the estate office. She said she found the documents. She said we had to act, or we'd lose everything." Hamish felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. The red herring, the builder's fear, the obvious trap in the barn was all a distraction. Angus had been groomed to commit a crime that someone else had already decided to orchestrate. He had been the blunt instrument for a much sharper, much colder mind. The real game had just begun. Hamish walked away from the woods, his mind swirling with the revelation that Angus, for all his bluster and fear, was merely a pawn. The builder had been fed specific, terrifying information by the local estate agent, Mrs. Campbell information that turned his understandable anxiety into a catalyst for violence. Hamish stopped at the edge of the loch, letting the biting wind whip his hair, and lit a cigarette, though he didn't really smoke. It was just a habit he used to help himself think when the picture refused to resolve. If Angus had been the blunt instrument, Mrs. Campbell was the architect. But why would an estate agent, whose success relied on property sales and development, sabotage a high-profile renovation project that would surely have brought her lucrative commissions and elevated her profile? It made no sense. Unless, of course, the motive wasn't about stopping development at all. It was about something much older and petty. He ducked into the warm, smelling of spices interior of the local curry shop, where the proprietor, Mr. Ali, was busy stirring a pot of something that smelled like paradise. "Hamish," Ali said, looking at a knowing smile, "you look like a man who has found a piece of a puzzle, but is worried about where it fits." "I'm worried about the whole picture." "Ali," Hamish said, sliding into his usual booth, "tell me, did Mrs. Campbell and Bartholomew Crane have a history beyond the business of the property?" Ali poured him a cup of steaming, heavily spiced tea. "A history, my friend. They had a tragedy. 20 years ago, Mrs. Campbell was another woman. She was a young, ambitious artist, and she had a love affair with a man visiting from London, a man with grand plans for the Highlands. He promised her the world, promised to build a studio, to make her famous, and then he vanished, left her with nothing but a broken heart and a reputation that took her years to rebuild in this village." Hamish took a slow sip of the tea, the warmth spreading through his chest. "Let me guess, the man from London, identical to Crane in every way?" Ali nodded. "The same arrogance, the same lifestyle, nonsense, the same complete lack of regard for the local way of life. When Crane arrived, it wasn't just a new client for Mrs. Campbell. It was a ghost, walking into her office, wearing the same suit, speaking with the same accent, and planning to do the exact same thing to her that had destroyed her life 2 decades ago. She didn't kill him for water rights. She killed him, or arranged for him to be killed, because she couldn't watch history repeat itself." The pieces fell into place with a sickening clarity. The disputed water rights were the bait she dangled in front of Angus, the trigger that would make him act. She knew the builder was desperate and prone to rash decisions, and she knew he had the physical strength to carry out the act of hanging Crane in the barn. She had used Angus's fear to manipulate him into doing the deed, knowing that if the police investigated, they would find a crime of passion, a crime of local greed, and never look behind the scenes at the woman who had quietly steered the entire tragedy. Hamish felt a wave of profound sadness. This was no grand mystery of international conspiracy or corporate warfare. It was a petty, human, and deeply painful grudge, born from a wound that had never healed. The hidden motive wasn't about land or money. It was about the crushing weight of memory. But even as he understood the why, he was left with the how. Mrs. Campbell was a woman of immense influence in the village, respected and admired. If he accused her, he would need more than a theory. He would need a confession, or at least a crack in her armor that Blair couldn't ignore. He left the curry shop and began the walk back toward the village square, where the evening shadows were lengthening over the snow. He wasn't afraid of the truth, but he was afraid of the cost. He knew that exposing Mrs. Campbell wouldn't just ruin her, it would tear the thin veil of peace that kept Lockdove functioning. It would expose the grudges, the secrets, and the simmering resentments that lay beneath the surface of every hearth in the village. As he reached the square, he saw Mrs. Campbell standing by her office, looking out at the mountains with a serene, terrifying stillness. She wasn't just waiting for the next client, she was waiting for the end of the story she had written. Hamish knew he was trapped, but he also knew he couldn't get away. He was the constable of Lockduff, and whether he liked it or not, it was his job to make sure the silence of the village wasn't built on a lie. He adjusted his coat, felt the weight of his responsibility, and stepped out into the open, ready to confront the architect of the tragedy. He knew he wouldn't get a second chance, and for once, he wasn't planning to look lazy or dim-witted. He was going to be the smartest person in the room, even if it cost him the only life he had ever known. The evening air was biting, a razor-edged frost that promised a long, dark night. Hamish Macbeth didn't return to the station. Instead, he made his way to the village hall, where a community meeting was scheduled to address the tragic loss of Bartholomew Crane. It was the perfect stage. Everyone who was anyone would be there, including the formidable Mrs. Campbell. Hamish had spent the last hour meticulously preparing his trap. He didn't have handcuffs or high-tech recording equipment, but he had something far more powerful in a village like Lochdubuff. He had the narrative. He knew gossip was the Highlands' currency, and he intended to spend it lavishly. He slipped into the back of the hall, just as the meeting was beginning. The room was packed with villagers, their faces tight with a mixture of grief, anger, and anxiety. At the front of the room stood DCI Blair, looking pleased with himself as he prepared to deliver his final, dismissive report on the accident. Beside him sat Mrs. Campbell, her posture perfect, her face a mask of composed sympathy. Hamish didn't sit. He moved to the shadows near the entrance, leaning against the wall, appearing to be nothing more than the lazy, unkempt constable hiding from his superior. He let Blair drone on for several minutes, describing the unfortunate series of events that had led to Crane's demise. The room listened in silence, their eyes fixed on the inspector. Then, at the precisely orchestrated moment, Hamish cleared his throat. It wasn't a loud sound, but in the hush of the hall, it seemed to vibrate against the rafters. "It's a curious thing, isn't it?" Hamish said, his voice slow, soft, and carrying a hint of genuine confusion. "The way people act when they're afraid. Fear makes us do strange things, like blaming a boy who never hurt a soul, or letting a builder take the fall for a crime he didn't quite commit." Blair stopped mid-sentence, his face flushing purple. "Macbeth, what are you doing here? Get out." Hamish ignored him. He kept his gaze fixed on the back of Mrs. Campbell's head. "I found something. A set of documents, old ones. They spoke of a woman who was wronged by a man who looked and talked exactly like our Mr. Crane. A woman who, 20 years ago, saw her future dismantled by the same kind of arrogant, outside intrusion. It's a tragic story, really. A story of a wound that never stopped bleeding." The hall went deathly silent. Mrs. Campbell stiffened, her spine turning to steel, but she didn't turn around. "And then," Hamish continued, his voice steadying, "I found another piece of evidence, a receipt for a very specific type of climbing rope, purchased not by the builder, but by someone who knew exactly how to use it. Someone who wasn't a carpenter, but who understood the structural integrity of a building and a person." He stepped out of the shadows, walking slowly toward the front of the room. He didn't look at Blair, he didn't look at the crowd. He looked only at Mrs. Campbell. "The interesting thing about a trap, Mrs. Campbell, is that it only works if the person setting it thinks they're the only one who knows the layout of the ground. You used Angus's fear. You used the village's collective anxiety, but you forgot one thing. You couldn't control the ghost of the man who died 20 years ago, and when he walked back into your life, you couldn't help but finish the story the way you wanted it to end." Mrs. Campbell stood up. Her face was pale, but her eyes were burning with a cold, terrifying intensity. "You have no proof, Constable. You have stories. You have speculation. You have nothing." "I have a witness," Hamish lied, his voice calm, his eyes searching hers for the slightest tremor. "Someone who saw you meeting with Angus at the back of your office the night before the body was found. Someone who heard you explaining exactly how to construct the rigging in that barn. It was a gamble, a massive, reckless, and entirely invented gamble. He didn't have a witness. He didn't have anything but a hunch and a deep understanding of the village's dark, interconnected heart. But he saw the flicker, the microscopic dilation of her pupils, the way her hand trembled as she clutched her handbag. She believed him because she feared the truth. "You're a fool, Hamish Macbeth," she said, her voice a low, dangerous whisper. "You're an unwashed, lazy, and utterly incompetent disgrace to the uniform. You think you can come in here and tear this village apart because you've read some old papers. Do you think anyone believes you over me?" "I don't need them to believe me," Hamish replied, still walking toward her, his pace slow and deliberate. "I just need them to listen to the truth. And the truth is, you didn't just want Crane dead. You wanted him to feel the same humiliation you felt 20 years ago. You didn't want a murder. You wanted an exhibition." Blair was shouting now, his face a vivid, apoplectic red, his voice drowning out everything else. "Arrest him? He's insane. Get him out of here." But the village was quiet. They were watching, waiting, their breath held in the cold, still air of the hall. Hamish had set the trap, and now he just had to wait to see if the predator would strike. He stood before her, the center of the room, the center of the storm. And for the first time in his life, he didn't look lazy. He looked like the only person who knew exactly where the darkness was hidden. The silence in the village hall was so absolute that the wind howling against the stone exterior sounded like a distant, mournful shriek. DCI Blair was still sputtering, his face transitioning from a dangerous puce to an alarming, mottled grey as his own officers, finally sensing the tectonic shift in the room, hesitated. They looked from their commanding officer to the tall, red-headed constable standing calmly before Mrs. Campbell. They were waiting to see who held the real authority, the man with the badges and the shouting, or the man who had peeled back the skin of the mystery with nothing but a few questions and an unwavering quiet stare. Mrs. Campbell didn't break. She stood perfectly still, her hands gripping her handbag with a tension that turned her knuckles white. The air between her and Hamish seemed to crackle with the energy of a brewing storm. She was a woman who had spent 2 decades carefully curating her image, a pillar of the community who had transformed her own trauma into a cold, efficient machine of control. Now, stripped of her shroud, she looked less like a respected professional and more like a cornered animal, calculating her final move. "You really are a tiresome little man, aren't you, Hamish?" she hissed, the politeness entirely drained from her voice. "You think you've uncovered some grand design. You think you're a hero. You're just a parasite, feeding on the misfortune of others because you're too pathetic to build a life of your own." She took a sharp step forward, her gaze darting toward the heavy, iron-bound door of the hall. For a heartbeat, Hamish thought she might bolt. But then her expression hardened into something far more dangerous. She didn't look like she was planning to run. She looked like she was planning to fight. Her hand moved toward the heavy decorative paperweight she kept on the podium, her fingers twitching with a sudden, violent intent. Hamish didn't blink. He had seen this look before, not on killers, but on desperate people who had finally realized their carefully constructed reality was coming apart. He didn't reach for his handcuffs. Instead, he kept his hands visible, his posture relaxed, a silent challenge that forced her to make the first move. "It's over, Mrs. Campbell," he said, his voice barely rising above a whisper. "The trap is closed. You can fight, but it won't change the truth. Angus has already spoken. He's told the truth about how you directed him, about the lies you told to turn his fear into a weapon. It was another gamble, a dangerous one. Angus hadn't spoken to the police, but Hamish knew the builder's fragile, guilt-ridden state. He was banking on the fact that Mrs. Campbell didn't know what Angus had or hadn't done, and he was banking on the power of her own paranoia. The effect was instantaneous. Mrs. Campbell's hand froze on the paperweight. Her eyes widened, the fierce, cold light within them flickering and dying. She looked around the room, finally registering the faces of the villagers, the people who had trusted her, the people she had manipulated, the people who were now staring at her with a mixture of shock and dawning realization. The mask had not just slipped, it had shattered entirely. She let out a sharp, jagged breath, and suddenly the strength left her. She slumped, the paperweight clattering to the floor with a dull, heavy thud that sounded like a gavel closing the proceedings. "I didn't mean for him to die," she whispered, the defiance draining from her face, leaving behind only the hollow, grey exhaustion of a life spent carrying a grudge. "I just wanted him to feel it. I just wanted him to know what it felt like to have everything you cared about destroyed in an instant." She collapsed into the chair behind the podium, her head dropping into her hands. The room erupted in a chaotic cacophony of gasps, whispers, and shouting. DCI Blair, finally finding his voice, lunged forward, his face once again flushing with self-important rage. "Seize her. Arrest this woman immediately, and someone got that constable away from me." Hamish stepped back, letting junior officers swarm the podium. He didn't feel the thrill of victory or the rush of an arrest. He felt only deep, heavy sadness. He had solved the mystery, but he had also irrevocably broken the quiet, carefully maintained peace of his village. As he watched them lead Mrs. Campbell away, a woman who had once been his neighbor, a woman who had once been a part of the tapestry of his life. He felt the weight of his duty pressing down on him like the Highland fog. He turned away from the commotion, slipping back toward the shadows near the door. He was finished. He had done his job. He had prevented an innocent boy from being jailed, and he had exposed the truth. But as he looked at the hollow, stunned faces of the villagers, he knew that Lochterbuff would never be the same. The mystery was gone, but the darkness, he suspected, was only just beginning to settle in. The aftermath of the community meeting was a chaotic blur of flashing police lights, aggressive questioning, and the bewildered, mournful murmuring of villagers who suddenly found themselves living in the wake of a scandal. DCI Blair was in his element, pacing the square like a conquering general, barking orders at anyone within earshot, and ensuring his presence was the most prominent feature of the scene. He had already begun reshaping the narrative, his voice booming across the freezing air as he claimed, quite loudly, that his meticulous, high-level tactical investigation had successfully flushed out the perpetrator after a cunning display of police pressure. Hamish Macbeth watched the proceedings from the periphery, his hands thrust deep into the pockets of his greatcoat. He stood near the entrance to the village hall, his posture slumped and his gaze unfocused, carefully projecting the image of a man who was utterly overwhelmed by the presence of his superiors. Lugs, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, sat quietly by his heels, his ears flattened against his head, as if trying to shield himself from the noise of the shouting and the whining of the police engines. Blair spotted Hamish and stomped, his face still flushed with a mix of adrenaline and ego. "Macbeth," he snapped, jabbing a finger toward the constable's chest. "I've heard that you were hovering around the hall earlier, making a nuisance of yourself with some ridiculous, unverified theories. Let this be a lesson to you. In the future, leave the actual police work to the professionals. Your little detective act was entirely unnecessary, and quite frankly, an impediment to the official investigation." Hamish offered a slow, blinking nod, managing to look like a man who was struggling to comprehend the complexity of the sentence being delivered to him. "Yes, sir. Very sorry, sir. Just thought I was helping, sir," Blair scoffed, his disdain for Hamish dripping from every word. "Helping? You were a distraction. Had it not been for my direct intervention and the pressure I applied, this woman would never have broken. I will, of course, be filing a report that highlights your complete lack of professional boundaries, and I expect it to be a permanent black mark on your record. If I see you trying to interfere with a criminal investigation ever again, I will personally ensure your next posting is in the most remote, miserable office in the entire Highlands." "I understand, sir," Hamish murmured, looking at his boots. "It won't happen again. I'll just stick to the patrol, sir." "Very sorry." Blair snorted, visibly pleased by the display of subservience. He clearly viewed Hamish as a relic, a slow-witted, lazy relic that he would have happily retired, were it not for the administrative headache it would cause. He turned on his heel, his coat swirling dramatically as he marched back toward his primary vehicle to confer with his team, already crafting the version of the incident that would ensure his own promotion to the next rank. Hamish watched him go, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. He didn't care about the black mark on his record. He didn't care about the reprimand or the insults, or the fact that his cunning work had been completely erased from the official record by a man who couldn't have found a clue if it had been pinned to his lapel. In fact, he found the entire charade to be a marvelous success. By letting Blair take all the credit, Hamish was effectively ensuring that no one from headquarters would ever look at him as a candidate for advancement. To be an effective detective in Lochterbuff, one had to be invisible, and by being painted as a useless peasant, Hamish had secured his invisibility for the foreseeable future. He saw Priscilla standing near the edge of the square, watching the entire scene with an expression of dry, knowing amusement. She caught his eye, a small, subtle smile playing on her lips before she turned and disappeared into the gloom. She knew, and he knew, and for Hamish, that was more than enough. He had prevented the wrong person from going to prison. He had uncovered a truth that was festering beneath the surface of his home, and he had done so without threatening his own quiet, solitary existence. As the last of the police cars pulled away, the village square began to empty, returning to the quiet, cold solitude of a Highland winter night. The snow began to fall again, soft and persistent, covering the traces of the evening's madness. Hamish felt the tension in his shoulders finally begin to dissipate. He looked toward the village, seeing the warm yellow glow of the lights in the windows, the familiar patterns of life beginning to reassert themselves despite the tragedy that had occurred. He had done what he wanted to do. He had protected his patch. He reached down and patted Lugs on the head, the dog responding with a soft, content huff. It was time to go home. The investigation was closed. The records would be written by a man who didn't know what he was talking about, and Hamish Macbeth was once again, officially, the most incompetent policeman in Scotland. The following week, the weather in Lochduff finally broke. The harsh, biting frost that had gripped the Highlands for days yielded to a soft, steady rain that washed the grey slush from the village streets and turned the hillsides into a rich, deep velvet green. It was the kind of damp, miserable weather that would have sent a tourist packing, but to Hamish Macbeth, it felt like a homecoming. The village was breathing again. The frantic energy that had followed the death of Bartholomew Crane had evaporated, replaced by the slow, rhythmic pace of Highland life that Hamish found so profoundly comforting. He was back in his station, the small, stone-walled building that smelled of damp wool, pipe tobacco, and the faint, lingering scent of the stew he had been simmering for the better part of the morning. The fire in the stove was crackling with a rhythmic, hypnotic intensity, and the radio in the corner was playing a soft, barely audible blend of traditional fiddle music and weather reports. Lugs was asleep on the rug, his paws twitching as he chased dream rabbits through the heather, completely oblivious to the fact that he was the most celebrated dog in the northern end of the county. Hamish sat in his battered armchair, a steaming mug of black coffee in one hand and a thick, well-worn book in the other. He hadn't bothered to open the book yet. He was far too occupied with the simple, exquisite joy of doing absolutely nothing. The phone on his desk sat in its cradle, silent and mercifully cold. There were no more reports to file, no more inquisitive outsiders to dodge, and no more looming threats of promotion. For now, the world had forgotten that Hamish Macbeth existed, and he was perfectly happy to keep it that way. Peace was briefly interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Hamish sighed, marking his page with a scrap of paper, and stood up to answer it. It was just Mrs. Guthrie from the post office, looking somewhat sheepish and holding a small, brown paper parcel. "Morning, Hamish," she said, offering a tight, friendly smile. "I was just out for a walk, and I thought you might like a bit of something fresh. These are the last of the shortbread biscuits for the season. I know how you like them with your coffee." "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Guthrie," Hamish said, taking the parcel with a genuine warm expression that rarely made its way into his dealings with the official world. "Come in, right? The coffee's fresh and the fire's warm." "Oh, I couldn't," she replied, shaking her head. "I just wanted to say, well, thank you for everything. The village feels right again. In a way, you've a way of keeping the scales balanced even when you're pretending you're not even looking at them." Hamish chuckled, a soft, self-deprecating sound. "I'm just a policeman, Mrs. Guthrie. I just keep the peace." "Aye," she said, her eyes twinkling, "and we all know exactly what kind of peace that is." When she left, Hamish returned to his chair and unwrapped the parcel. The shortbread was rich, buttery, and perfect. He poured another cup of coffee, the steam curling into the damp air, and leaned back, listening to the rain drumming against the window pane. He thought about the events of the past week, about the tragedy of Mrs. Campbell and the arrogance of Bartholomew Crane, and he felt a quiet, settled satisfaction. He hadn't sought the chaos, but he had managed it, and in doing so, he had ensured that his own small, isolated world remained intact. He knew that the Highlands were never truly peaceful. They were simply waiting for the next storm to roll in over the mountains. There would be other crimes, other outsiders with loud voices and grand plans, and other secrets buried beneath the peat and the heather. But for now, that was a problem for another day. For now, there was the warmth of the fire, the taste of the shortbread, and the quiet, constant presence of the loch outside his window. He looked over at Lugs, who had shifted positions and was now snoring with a contented, rhythmic wheeze. Hamish smiled, his eyes drifting shut. He was exactly where he wanted to be. He had avoided the promotion. He had stayed in his beloved Lockdove. And he had secured the only thing he truly cared about, the freedom to live his life, day by day, in his own slow, quiet way. The village was safe, the mystery was forgotten, and Hamish Macbeth was finally blissfully back to his routine. He took a sip of his coffee, pulled his coat a little tighter against the draught, and let the silence of the Highlands wash over him. It was a good day to be in Lockdove, and tomorrow, he decided, would be even better.